Excuse me. This morning, we begin our summer sermon series, as you see here on the slides, entitled Named and Unnamed. This will be about women found in Scripture. And I will be kicking off this series today with a short, brief introduction to this theme and sharing my own perspective as the token male of the pastoral team. It is true that we're going to keep this a little shorter today because we do have a council meeting and meal we want to get to, so we're going to keep things tight here. But I did want to mention that. In fact, I am the only full or part-time male staff member on the entire church staff, with the exception of Ron Bellamy, who helps to lead the bell choir. So it's just us. Now, I suspect this is pretty rare amongst most multi-pastor staff churches, but I think it's a beautiful thing. And I hope that you can appreciate that on my last Sunday before Sabbath Rest, my inclusion in kicking off this series about women should not be seen as mansplaining on this topic, but instead an opportunity for my colleagues to later clarify and correct my mistakes as we go throughout the summer. The ways in which male voices have primarily shaped Christianity is apparent in many of the male-dominated structures and organizations that we can see both inside and outside of the church. Patriarchy. This is the term most commonly used to describe the dominant ways that males have controlled systems and structures of power throughout our past. We see this reflected in almost all of history and culture. And while the origins of the word history may not actually be tied to any masculine term, it is ironic that history has so often been told as his story and not necessarily her story. Despite many important biblical figures being women, Christianity has played a significant role in perpetuating discrimination against women in the church and in the broader society. The insistence of many churches for teaching gendered roles and complementarianism in relationships has done a significant amount of harm. There is a huge gap between men and women choosing certain roles and responsibilities in a relationship that suit their needs and giftedness versus being told that one is expected or needed to perform in certain ways or certain roles or responsibilities because of their sex or gender expression. Throughout history, women have often been expected to be subservient to men in their lives, and they were regulated to the sidelines in church leadership. In many denominations and churches, including some within the Church of the Brethren, women are forbidden from holding pastoral, teaching, or authoritative positions over men in the church. This is often based on specific readings and understandings of certain scripture. Texts like 1 Timothy chapter 2 that says, "Let a woman learn quietly in submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." Sorry. For the men who have favored and often benefited from patriarchy in churches, these words from the Bible are often not contextualized within the broader text, and certainly not understood within the context of other places in Scripture where women clearly were in leadership roles and positions in the early church. Not only were women named as leaders in the early church, like Phoebe, Lydia, Priscilla, and many others, but the Samaritan woman at the well could be considered the very first evangelist. And Jesus himself appears first to women after the resurrection, entrusting them with good news. This may not have seemed radical to Jesus, but for the time and place, it may have been seen that way. The culture was patriarchal, and so the very fact that the Bible recognizes the contributions of women in these ways is in fact somewhat special, and others noticed that too. Celsus, a 2nd century Greek philosopher who was a critic of Christianity, sees the involvement of women as something to be mocked or as a weakness. And he does so in a number of his writings, pointing out that the involvement of women is actually not a good thing for Christianity. He calls it, and many people have identified this as being a weakness. It is not a weakness. What is a weakness, however, and foolish, is seeking to silence, ignore, and control half of the world's population based on gender. For centuries, entire generations of girls have grown up being taught, either blatantly or subtly or subconsciously, that they are to be subservient to the men in their lives. And perhaps even more problematic, generations of boys have observed this same message. I think it's fortunate that children born today are hopefully and perhaps experiencing this differently than perhaps 50 years ago. But do not underestimate the power of representation. The women who have continually challenged this dynamic have been examples for future generations. I've spoken to women who may have otherwise felt called into ministry, but had zero examples of female leadership in the church and never knew that women as church leaders even existed. There are college students who have attended our worship services and remarked that it's the first time that they've ever heard a woman preach. But others, despite seeing patriarchy in the world around them, grew up with female leaders in the church, and that made all the difference. For me, despite being aware of this disparity within the church, seeing women as spiritual leaders over men is not that strange or foreign to my own personal experience. Perhaps most significantly, I can say, without hesitation, that I would not be standing here today in ministry if it were not for women who played an essential role in my life. There is, of course, my own mother. I want to include her. But within the Church of the Brethren specifically, I knew that my aunt was a pastor, and so that was a clear example to me that women could be leaders in the church. Some of you may know Tracy Sadd, who had become the chaplain at E-Town College, was a pastor of mine for a few years when I was a child at Hemfield Church of the Brethren. When I was at Camp Swatara working my first years as a counselor in that ministry, Michelle Gibble was my first real boss in a ministry setting. At Laverne Church of the Brethren, Janet Ober and Susan Boyer were the co-pastors who helped to shepherd my life in an incredibly important time, transitional and important time in my life. Back at camp, I worked closely with Lynetta Ballou, who was the camp administrator, and here at E-Town Church of the Brethren, Pam and Naomi and Liz have been important role models and mentors for me in ministry. Despite there being much more work to do, there's also been an incredible progress over the years, and we are all better off for it. An essential part of understanding this shift over time is recognizing that it has not merely been about improving the lives and opportunities for women, but dismantling patriarchal practices in the church benefits everyone. Men, women, and those who identify as non-binary have all benefited from the increased leadership and giftedness of many individuals and collectives of women in the church and society at large. I'm certain that there are women in this congregation who could share about the kinds of changes that they have witnessed and observed in their lifetime, both in society and here in this congregation. It is shocking, though, to me that even in my own lifetime, it was still legal to require a woman to have a male relative as a co-signer on a business loan. My lifetime. This didn't change until 1988. I consider it a privilege and an honor to serve in a church community that recognizes and respects women as pastors and church leaders. I could not imagine having it any other way for my own daughter as she grows up in this church, but also for my son. I would not, in good conscience, be a part of a church community that supported discrimination based on those understandings of gender roles within the church. So I invite you to truly listen and hear these stories this summer of many named and unnamed women of the Bible, not merely for some kind of quota or representation, but because their stories are our stories, and we are all better off learning and knowing them. May their lives and stories encourage you, and may you also be blessed by the wisdom and generosity of the women preachers who will share them this summer.